Hello, this is Corey Probst. Want to thank you for joining me. We are covering the topic of mastering your mental edge tonight. 5 factors for maximizing your mental mojo, and specifically pertaining to dieting and weight loss and the obesity epidemic that we're facing at this point in time. The way that I'd like to start this podcast is in giving you a bit more information about the history of kind of where we've come from in terms of the weight loss industry, where we're headed in terms of the dire situation we are regarding obesity, and what I see the primary factors being in the difficulty that so many people have in losing weight, but also in losing weight successfully and long term. When I say successfully, I mean in a manner that is sustainable and maintainable. 98% of people gain their weight back after engaging in a weight loss endeavor, and it's often and primarily due to rigid, restrictive dieting practices that do not take into consideration the individual's unique circumstances. And these circumstances can include their genetics, their medical conditions, medications that they're taking, their food preferences, their lifestyles, their family situations. So when a diet does not consider these variables, and when the diet in tandem with a lack of regard for them really restricts an individual to certain foods in an eat this, not that sort of a fashion, and asks the individual to eat at these particular times in these particular amounts and doesn't necessarily incorporate any flexibility, it's not necessarily a surprise that most people would fail. Most diets will garner an individual weight loss. They will. But again, it's short-term, and it doesn't incorporate any sort of education and knowledge into not just the process, but the behaviors, the skills, any anticipation of setbacks and how to move forward from those, any sort of behavioral work in regarding to emotion management and development of emotional intelligence. And so as we're talking tonight, I'd like you to think about how all of these aspects, the psychological, the sociological, and even our biology has to play a role in any weight loss endeavor, any weight loss goal. Each of us is influenced by and has an influence on the constructs with which we interact. We live in a world where we are constantly bombarded by temptation and can be easily thrown off what is going to be congruent with behavior that will help us meet our goals. So in a world where we might feel as if our lives are governed by the circumstances surrounding us, how many times have I heard, well, there's just all this stuff going on and I just couldn't, you can fill in the blank. For example, how we act, the way that we think, who and how we choose to connect with and gain support from, what we choose to believe, our environments, our genetics, all of those things have an impact on our health, longevity, and our ability to meet our goals, not just weight loss goals, but any goal that's important to us. So to give you a bit of history, over the last decade, obesity in the U.S. has risen at such a rapid rate, it's called an epidemic. That's a big deal. The National Center for Health Statistics took a survey, and in 1980, obesity was approximating about 15% of the American population. Over the last 14 years, obesity increased by 75%. So more than a third of the population is now considered obese, and an equal proportion is at risk for becoming obese. We know that obesity affects multiple systems within the body and contributes to diseases such as coronary heart disease, diabetes, osteoarthritis, high blood pressure, hypercholesterolemia, and asthma, and those are just a few. Other harmful conditions that may not be as immediately dangerous are things like poor sleep and gastroesophageal reflux, so GERD. Healthcare costs are rising because of obesity, and the physical and emotional ramifications of obesity are increasingly debilitating. With each pound of fat that is added onto a person's frame, not only do our brains suffer, but our ability to do much of anything in terms of activity becomes that much more difficult. Our motivation declines, our interest in social endeavors suffers, and it's not uncommon for comorbid psychiatric disorders to really surface and rise as weight rises. This problem, with every subsequent weight loss attempt, increases. So it's a huge concern. When we look at what the factors are that are involved in obesity, of course, we can look at fast food and how there are so many franchises and cheap places to eat that are providing very calorically dense meals. And when you see how these establishments are expanding the boundaries of the U.S., so like Great Britain, where there, within a 9-year period, obesity increased at the same rate as fast food establishments were built. I'm not sure that's a coincidence. The countries that have less access to and spend less on fast food, guess what? They demonstrate lower rates of obesity. So our environment is a key factor. Genetics also contribute to one's obesity propensity. But it's those external influences and factors within the environment that are far more powerful when we consider what the messages are that we're getting through the media. I like to call this food porn. And I think Jimmy John's does an excellent example of really capitalizing on what they know are going to get people in the doors. Free smells, they're advertising. They know that if they have someone smell that scent of wafting sandwiches out of their building, they're going to be tempted in a way that will probably get them to walk through their doors. Then you have Food Network, and you have shows like Iron Chef, and you have the Cupcake Wars, and you guys know all of those shows. But it's very interesting to see and understand how the media affects our propensity to eat more food than we really need, and how controlled we can be by those things in such a subconscious way. But when we are more aware, we and can recognize how we are influenced and swayed in a certain way, then we have the power to make changes to our behavior, when we can recognize those things. So the availability of energy-dense food and the just ubiquitous reach of food cues everywhere in our environment, when you see the signs and the commercials and the radio ads and the billboards, everything advertising food, and you couple that with the lack of activity, you see how it can become so easy to become fat, to become obese. And it almost seems like our fate is kind of sealed in terms of being the fattest nation. But we have to consider, and this falls in line with what I was saying about knowledge, understanding, recognition, we have to consider the element of personal responsibility that comes with food consumption, in addition to maybe how the neurochemical, hormonal environments that we live in and are part of our anatomy and bodies play a role. So when food is scarce, which is pretty rare nowadays, it's everywhere. I often tell my clients, if you've had a meal and, when you're dieting, you've had a meal, but you still want to eat, one of the best things that I've found that helps me is to remember that this is not the Last Supper. Like, I have another meal coming. This is not the last time that I'm going to be able to eat this food. And that's one of the problems, is that with so many diets being so restrictive, oftentimes that is the problem. The individual isn't able to eat those foods that they enjoy, and so they feel like if they do have an opportunity or a chance to get them, they better get it all in at once, because that opportunity isn't going to last long, and it's not going to come about again for a very long time. But we don't really have that problem. Studies have shown that the environmental condition significantly impacts the response to food and intake, though. So a deprivation state, being hungry all the time, it will impact the amount of food eaten when food is in front of us. This makes sense. So subsequently, it creates a learned value that's placed on a particular food. Whether that food is something like broccoli, which is one of my favorites, or it's chocolate cake, if one of us were consistently fed broccoli following a period of significant hunger, guess what we would place a huge incentive value on? And that value would increase according to our level of deprivation. So the hungrier I am, the more I'm going to move towards that food that satisfied that hunger, whether it's healthy or not healthy. So on the flip side of the coin, even if I'm hungry and I'm provided with a highly tasty, calorically dense, yummy, decadent food, if that food caused me to feel sick, like food poisoning, even if I'm hungry in the future, it's not likely that if I were offered that food that I'd eat it, because now I've developed an aversion for it. It didn't result in pleasure. It resulted in pain. There's a researcher named Benoit, and he calls this the deprivation discrimination process. And it serves to really confirm the learned behavioral responses to food and how much and why we consume certain foods. So our appetites really rely on this cumulative equation of energy signal states. So where are we in terms of a hunger continuum? Am I super, super hungry? Do I feel like I'm starving and famished, or am I just kind of hungry? If we're just kind of hungry and we eat a food and it doesn't give us a huge sense of pleasure, then that response, that desire for that food again, isn't going to be as strong. So the other thing that appetite relies on are environmental food cues, obviously, and then the eating consequences. And it's the hypothalamus of the brain stem, and it's the corticolimbic areas of the brain that serve as the control centers for navigating eating behaviors. The limbic system is that emotional center of the brain, and the hypothalamus is involved in memory. So we know that there are genetic components, right, and we know that there are environmental causes of obesity. We know that there are certain areas of the brain that impact memory and learning and emotion and behavior that are involved in food and appetite. And all of these things impact and act in tandem with and coordination with physiological cues and states that we experience, like hunger and thirst. So all of those factors are involved in learned associations that we acquire as a result of either having a pleasurable experience or an aversive eating experience. And then what those factors do and what those experiences do is they allow us to make decisions according to our environments. So it's important to understand that these aspects are really crucial to understanding our motivation to eat. And for individuals who are losing weight, it is imperative that we start to really take notice of and observe what our patterns are around food. We all have these food rules, and this is where this is more cognitive. So what have we based on our food identities? For example, if we grew up in an environment where food was always available, we could always have as much as we wanted, versus an environment where it was very scarce and we had to get in as much as we could at one time, versus the individual who has dieted since she was the age of 5 and dieted with her mom, versus the individual who was given food as a representation of love or given food when she was upset. So food became very emotional and soothing. And you can imagine in that sort of situation how this person could grow up and what messages this person would carry and stories this person would carry about food. So it's a multi-layered issue. But again, what I want to really hone in on is that we have the ability to think about how we behave. We have the ability to think about how we think. We have the ability to be open and objective and conscious about our behaviors so that we can understand them better and modify what we're doing in an effort to meet our goals more successfully. So understanding our motivations for eating, in addition to how they differ between the normal weight person versus an obese or overweight person, is kind of important, and it's interesting what the research shows. There's a misperception that exists for eating behavior among the obese in regards to taste. And there's this underlying assumption that obese people eat more because of the sensory properties of food. However, when foods that are enjoyable aren't scarce, the liking of the food that's selected and eaten occurs uniformly. So in other words, where food is plenty and it all tastes good, when another food is added, it doesn't necessarily change the amount in terms of energy intake consumed. When comparing the liking, quote-unquote liking, and the wanting of food, liking has been described as like immediate or anticipated sensory pleasure. So, in other words, when you like something, when you first take a bite, you really enjoy the taste of it. Whereas wanting, on the other hand, it's derived from learned associations of pleasure. Learned associations, remember that, those connections between things that have happened before, or a desire that results in motivation to eat. So neither one of them, a liking of a food or a wanting of a food, is actually related to actual hunger. And neither have really been assessed as different in normal versus obese individuals. However, what is different, what is discrepant, is the responsiveness to the cues that prompt the liking or the wanting. And that's been shown to be much higher in obese individuals. So, in other words, what is it that influences the liking or the wanting? Outside of hunger, when presented with food choices, the better liked food is eaten by normal weight and obese people alike. When you're not hungry and you're presented with a food, the food that is preferred is eaten by both groups. So, it's not necessarily a change in food palatability or savoriness or flavor that can explain the rise in obesity. I talked about food identities. And this is really important in terms of the stories that we create in regards to who we are, what we can do, who we'll become, and can really explain our behaviors. In terms of responsiveness to food appears to be related to values, some related more to immediate gratification, for example, to relieve, a gnawing sense of hunger, and related to a more intrinsic and long-term reward orientation. So what I mean by that is, say we all know those individuals who really diet well. And by that I mean they have a motivation level that is related to what's most important to them in life. It's not related to necessarily so much how I look on the outside, how I'm going to fit in my clothes, how I'm going to look beautiful on my wedding day. When I say intrinsic, I mean it's woven into the fabric of who they are. It's become a part of them on a much deeper level. So responsiveness to food among these people is really more related to things like health, the impact that their eating habits have on their children, on brand awareness, like how they feel morally about eating animals. I mean, that's something that's woven into the fiber of their beings. Other things like monetary and budget concerns, and then even convenience. So obviously, there are unconscious drivers like desire, based on previous experiences, that we may not be conscious of, but there are also the conscious drivers that we are observant of, that we do make decisions based on. And it's those things that are part of mastering the mental edge in losing weight most consistently. Unconsciously, when I'm just eating freely, when my energy balance is controlled through physiological regulatory mechanisms, I can't necessarily do much about what's going on inside of my body and how my cells are reacting, save for doing what I can control consciously, like eating the healthiest foods possible, eating organic, so I'm not, consuming any pesticides, getting enough exercise, those sorts of things. But those unconscious behaviors are what's happening on the inside, regulated by your body, that you don't necessarily have control over. If at one time, for example, you eat a really calorically dense meal, let's use the Super Bowl as an example. I am snacking all day long, and I consume just a lot more food than I typically would. The need would dictate a decrease in consumption later, right? I've consumed a ton, and now my body self-regulates. I don't need as much the next day or the next meal. On the other hand, should I decrease my intake, that corrective response may be that I'm not expending as much energy. And so when food is available, I might consume more. This is the cycle of weight stabilization. And when we get to maintenance mode, although we are conscious of what we're taking in and how we're doing that, what we're consuming in terms of proteins, carbs, and fats, and what's going to help us feel more stable, there's this weight stabilization and balancing effect. When you go from a situation where you eat freely, and we all know people who have never had a weight problem, who just eat when they're hungry and they stop when they're full, right? That's what I call eating freely. They've never been concerned about weight, they've never dieted, and they just maintain their weight well. When someone like that would go from a very rule-driven and depriving diet, that's when weight regulation issues arise. When individuals who consciously make the decision to diet and construct rigid food rules. Now, let me convey that there's nothing wrong with dieting. Individuals who are overweight, it is okay to enlist in the help of a diet to lose weight, but healthily, one that is not rigid. If it's rigid, and that can include forbidden foods and limitations for food intake, it is common to exhibit increased desire and responsiveness to food when it's offered. We've all experienced this, so that's what we call temptations, right? But if the diet is so restrictive that it doesn't take into consideration anything that you enjoy, increased binging can occur, cravings can be out of control, lack of control with stopping when you're eating has been shown. So it's not surprising that individuals, the more they diet, the more they gain. Most people will lose weight, gain as much as they lost, and then some. And then when the food is eaten that the person has been staying away from, significant pleasure occurs. The brain just dumps out dopamine. The reward centers of the brain are on fire. And then under those circumstances, guess what? Now we have created the optimal conditions for food being intimately connected with our moods. Now we've created the optimal conditions for emotional eating based on that food's incentive value. The food that's most coveted by restrained eaters will be eaten in greater amounts due to its high value, high emotional value. So when negative emotions are experienced, even in the absence of hunger or a need to fuel the body, that person will experience a conditioned response to eat to elevate the mood. A person who's anxious, a person who is depressed, they'll engage in excessive eating to feel better. In studies, they have induced anxiety among dieting obese individuals. They've induced a bad mood and have shown an increase in food consumption. So it's like a negative feedback loop. Eating can increase with feelings of distress, of anxiety, of negative emotion, and that triggers more eating. And then as the person obsesses or ruminates on the breakdown of the diet's constraints or rules, what happens is an escalation of more anxiety. So it's that cycle. We've all heard about the binge restrict cycle. So you have a food that's not within your dietary structure. You feel bad, so you eat more. So you feel worse, you eat more. Negative feedback loop. And this is called counter-regulation in the literature. You've probably heard me call it the what the hell effect. And it's been shown in experiments to occur when a subject is given a meal, and it's typically one of high caloric density, before being given another meal and a direction to eat freely. And what's been shown is that restrained eaters, the ones who are on very restrictive diets, eat more as compared to normal weight people. So as a result of a perceived sense of failure to maintain control with the first meal, they consumed more during the second meal. A cognitively mediated response, right? So we have a lot of information in regards to the factors that are related to dieting failure and to what is influencing a person's ability to lose weight effectively. But let's go over the 5 factors. What can you do in order to stay the course, in order to maximize your motivation, to have that mental edge, to move closer, to take those steps in a very consistent manner towards your goal? The first thing is to practice presence. And what I mean by this is to practice being mindful, to practice being deliberate and conscious in your decisions, in your behavior, to understand what you're doing and what's influencing you. And I like to ask myself the question of, is what I'm focusing on right now, is this where I need to be in my mind? Is this helping me? Is this in my best interest? Is this getting closer? Is this helping me get closer to what's important to me and what I've said I want to accomplish? Being mindful means having a sense of non-judgment towards myself too. So expecting that I'm probably going to make mistakes along the way, but that I can use these as learning experiences. I can take responsibility instead of getting down on myself and beating myself up, and know that I can grow from them. The second thing is to be bouncy. And what I mean by that is to practice having a level of reboundability. Reboundability is a skill, and it means that we can bounce back fairly quickly from setbacks. It means that we're more resilient. We can move through less than ideal circumstances with greater ease. And we can let go of the need to control everything around us. We can direct our attention towards what we can control and attune to what we can actually influence, what we have a measure of influence over. It means that we need to consider our competence level. What are our capacities? And are we using them? That's the big thing. We have so many skills and abilities, and oftentimes when, quote-unquote, something goes wrong, those fly out the window. We don't consider those. We move into stress mode, and we think that it's over, that we've failed, that we're never going to be able to do what we want to accomplish. So I encourage you to really think about what you have accomplished in your life, outside of weight loss, outside of your dieting goals, what you've accomplished and how you've done it. What did you do when a mistake occurred? How did you get back up? How did you get to that outcome? You've done it before in other areas of your life, and you can apply those same skills in this situation. And you have to ask, do I believe that I can grow? And can I approach new experiences with motivation, with commitment? Can I? So the second thing is reboundability. The third factor for maximizing your mental motivation is to attend to your attitude. Attitude is the way that you direct yourself toward the way that you think. Are you paying attention to how much influence your thoughts have over your behavior? Are you paying attention to the way that your emotions guide your behavior? You hear parents say all the time, pay attention to me. They're trying to redirect their child's attention so that they know what they're saying is being heard. If you think about this in the context of your own life, ask how often you're just going through the motions, doing things the way you've always done them because you always have. We are very easy influenced by patterns of behavior. And you've heard me talk about how day to day we can just act like zombies. We're not thinking about what we're doing. We're not thinking about the future. We're not thinking about, it's just like go, 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 and we're not settled or conscious at all. So it's worth it to ask, where am I directing my attention? How am I dedicating myself to the way that I think? Am I paying attention to how the way I think is influencing the way that I act? And the biggest thing that I see is that because of our lack of mindfulness and because of our lack of or skill in being able to tune our attention and our awareness, is that we have a lot of difficulty being in and managing discomfort. We want to run. We want to avoid. And a lot of times this is how emotional eating manifests. It's not the food that's the problem. It's our ability to be with the emotion that doesn't feel so good. It's not the food. The food is the symptom. The food gives us immediate pleasure at a time when we're experiencing pain or discomfort that we don't want to feel. Except it's exactly what we need to feel. We have to go through it in order to get out of it, if that makes sense. It has to be acknowledged. And research even shows that when we can name the emotion, we can tame the emotion. So that acknowledgement, that attunement to what we're actually experiencing in our bodies and in our heads makes a huge difference in our ability to actually calm down and feel better. The amygdala is involved in expression of emotion in the small little almond-shaped organ in our brains. Activation of the amygdala actually declines when we name what we're experiencing, when we acknowledge it. That's pretty huge. The other thing that's what I would encourage you to ask is, if you're defining your circumstances as uncomfortable when they just are, ask yourself what the facts of the situation are, not what is the story you're telling yourself. Oftentimes we are so locked in the subjective experience that we need to step out of and look at the experience from an outsider's perspective. If I were a fly on the wall, what would I just see? So it's like watching the movie instead of being in it. And this is very empowering. We learn that we're okay. We will be okay. So the third thing is attend to your attitude. The fourth thing is find the feeling. And the main crux of this is developing emotional intelligence and bodily intelligence. Emotions are bodily signals of what needs our attention. They're cues. We have them for a reason. We can never get rid of them. They will occur whether we want them to or not. So how about we learn how to use them to our advantage? So ask yourself, how do I know I'm actually feeling anxious? How do I know? What tells me that? Someone may say, you look anxious. But if you're calling a feeling anxious, how do you know that's anxious? Is your heart beating fast? Are you having trouble concentrating? Is your chest tight? Are your fingers clenched? Examine that. Because what if you could just say, my heart's beating fast? What if you didn't even have to call it something negative? What if you said, this is anxiety instead of I'm anxious? Would it remove the intensity of it a little bit? Would it distance you a little bit from it? I bet it would. So the point is to be able to start identifying what you're experiencing. How do you know that what you've said you're feeling is what you're feeling? What if you've said it's anxiety and it's actually excitement? Would that change your behavior? So the fourth thing is find your feeling. The fifth thing is to pursue your passion. So many of us are living stories that aren't ours. We're living stories that were written for us by our caregivers, by the people who raised us, by our friends, by our spouses, by our siblings. We're doing things in our lives because other people think we need to or should to. Those aren't our passions, they're someone else's. And we will never quite feel fulfilled if we're living someone else's goals and dreams and stories. So we have to ask ourselves, what do I value? What's important to me? How much of my life is being geared toward what other people have said is important, but maybe I don't really feel that way? Autonomy is one of our most basic psychological motivations and needs. It drives us, along with connection and competence. Autonomy means that we feel like we have a sense of choice, that what we're doing is important to us individually. It means that I don't feel forced or coerced in any way, and that I've chosen this. Imagine what difference it would make if, when you're dieting, when you're moving toward any sort of a goal, you've got a support person that is your teammate who asks you questions and says, what do you think? What's important to you? If we were going to move towards this direction or that direction, which one do you feel like would be in your best interest? As opposed to, here's your meal plan. Don't deviate from that. You have to eat at these times, and you can never eat these foods. I couldn't do that, whether it's related to dieting or anything. We all want certainty. We do. But once we feel like that certainty has us backed into a corner and gives us no choice or autonomy, all we want to do is move as far away from that as we can. And then, unfortunately, we see that as failure because we didn't do what that person or that meal plan said we had to. And it has nothing to do with personal failure at all. So number 5 is pursue your passion. I'm going to go over those 5 one more time. Number 1 is practice presence and mindfulness. Number 2 is reboundability. 3, attend to your attitude. So redirecting your attention to where it needs to be. 4, find the feeling. Learn emotional and body intelligence. And 5, pursue your passion. Ask whose stories you're living and if your goals are your own. So thank you for joining me tonight. I would love your comments and feedback. You can email me at Kori, spelled Kori, at thedietdoc.com. Thank you.